Good morning and welcome to our Sunday morning Bible study of the book of Acts. We are continuing our study here via live stream from the Central Church of Christ in Martinsburg, West Virginia. It's great to be with you. I'm happy that you have joined our live stream, and I would invite you now to get out your Bible, be turning to the book of Acts. If you have not already gotten your worksheets out, you should have received those by email. You want to get your worksheet out and follow along with the questions. We will try to work through that together, as well as working together through the text in a word-for-word fashion in this particular study. Acts chapter 21. Today, in Acts chapter 21, we're going to resume our study down at verse 27. You remember that last week the Apostle Paul had completed this, what is known as the third missionary journey. I do have the map of the third missionary journey on the screen before you, and the red line shows his route of travel along with his companions. And as he was concluding that journey, he was stopping at various congregations, picking up the contribution that they had laid by in store for the poor saints at Jerusalem. And these were mainly Jewish Christians at Jerusalem who were suffering the effects of that famine that Agabus and others had, Agabus specifically had predicted, and others were suffering from that famine as well. So you have the map there that shows his return from and the conclusion of the third missionary journey. And then at Jerusalem, we studied last week how Paul was to go into the temple to essentially pay for the sacrifices for certain Jewish brothers who had taken a vow. And we saw that this was a way of trying to disarm prejudice against Paul, because there were many who might not understand that he was being respectful of the customs. And even though the old law had been nailed to the cross, legally its effect was completed at the cross. Still, there was sort of a transitional period, you might say, or a time where some of those customs lingered. And even in the church, there were some members who would continue to observe some of those customs that didn't violate the gospel. We talked about the fact last week that some of the customs of the old law can be practiced even today. For example, circumcision. Even though it really has no religious significance, it certainly is not a violation of the gospel. And we wouldn't be teaching that it's wrong just because the old law has been nailed to the cross. We mentioned at the close of last week that we need to distinguish between things which we are at liberty to do for the sake of others, and on the other hand, things which we are bound to do, required to do, in order to obey God. Now, there is a difference between those things. So Christians sometimes will find themselves doing things for the benefit of others. Paul would say, for example, to the church at Corinth, to the Jews, I became a Jew. That is, he would adopt certain customs so as not to offend his audience, even though they were not required, and he certainly didn't place any religious significance upon them. But in the course of this, which seemed to be working well, this strategy of disarming their prejudice, we're going to find now, beginning at verse 27, that certain Jews from outside, that is, from Asia, come into the picture and stir up trouble for the Apostle Paul. So let's begin reading at Acts chapter 21, verse 27. I'm going to read down through verse 30. And when the 7 days were almost completed, the Jews from Asia, when they saw him in the temple, stirred up all the multitude and laid hands on him, crying out, Men of Israel, help! This is the man that teacheth all men everywhere against the people and the law and this place. And moreover, he brought Greeks also into the temple and hath defiled this holy place. For they had before seen with him in the city Trophimus the Ephesian, whom they supposed that Paul had brought into the temple. And all the city was moved, and the people ran together, and they laid hold on Paul and dragged him out of the temple, and straightway the doors were shut. On your worksheet, which is 35, about the middle of the page, you'll see those verses set forth in bold print. And then we begin with question number 1 under those verses, which is near the end of the purification period, that is the 7 days, which we've already discussed. Jews from Asia stirred up the people against Paul. Now, the word Asia there, of course, that's a broad word. On the map, you can see sort of in the center of the map is sort of a pinkish area representing Asia. Asia included the city of Ephesus. You remember that back in chapter 20, Paul had met with the Ephesian elders, those elders at Ephesus. And Ephesus is where Paul had spent 3 years laboring. So it's very possible, indeed very likely, that some of the people in that area knew him well, and we know that the Jews in that area had become agitated against Paul, and at times these Jews were so intent on opposing him that they even confront him in distant Jerusalem, where he is now. Question 2. Identify from the list below the charges against Paul. Well, one of the charges was that he teaches all men everywhere against the people. They also said that he teaches against the temple, that is, against this place. They were talking about the temple. We need to understand that the temple was and is a very religious, significant place to the Jewish people. And they valued the temple very highly. They would consider themselves defenders of the sanctity of the temple, and that the word temple carries the idea of the dwelling place of God. That is an idea that's carried over even spiritually into the new law, that the church is the temple of God, that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit, Paul would say in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. So they prized the temple very highly. You remember this was one of the accusations against our Lord, that he claimed that he was going to destroy the temple. And then in 3 days build it up and so on. Not realizing, perhaps, that he was talking about the temple of his body, not the physical structure. So one of their accusations against Paul was that he was teaching against the temple. They accused him also of defiling the temple by bringing Gentiles into the Jewish court. Now notice, one of those is mentioned by name. Verse 29 says they had before seen him in the city of Trophimus, the Ephesian. That's question 3. Why did his accusers think that Paul had brought Greeks into the temple? Well, it's because they had earlier seen him with Trophimus, who was an Ephesian. He was a Greek. Notice that there isn't anything that suggests that he actually brought Trophimus into the temple. Also, an accusation was that he was teaching against the old law. Teaching against the old law. True or false? Question 4. The people of the city basically ignored these false charges. Of course, that would be false. They didn't ignore them. They found these charges to be very upsetting. And this leads to Paul being mobbed in the temple. We notice here that these references to the temple evidently refer to the inner court, not the outer court, where Gentiles were in fact permitted. So there was a distinction between that outer section of the temple and the more restricted inner court. Acts chapter 21, verse 31, beginning. And as they were seeking to kill him, tidings came up to the chief captain of the band, and that all Jerusalem was in confusion. And forthwith he took soldiers and centurions and ran down upon the people. And they, when they saw the chief captain and the soldiers, left off beating Paul. Then the chief captain came near and laid hold on him, and commanded him to be bound with 2 chains, and inquired who he was and what he had done. And some shouted one thing, some another, among the crowd. And when he could not know the certainty for the uproar, he commanded him to be brought into the castle. And when he came upon the stairs, so it was that he was borne of the soldiers for the violence of the crowd. For the multitude of the people followed after, crying out, "Away with him!" Question 1 on page 136. As they were attempting to put Paul to death, the blank of the band, that would be the chief captain of the band. And I have in parentheses there, that is 1,000. Let's be reminded now that a band is a reference to 1,000 soldiers. There would be a chief captain over that band. The Roman military soldiers, the legions as they were known at that time, were composed of cohorts of 1,000 men each. And the commander of a cohort was called a chiliarch, a leader of 1,000. And the commander of the hundreds within that was called a centurion. So when we read about a centurion, that is the commander of 100 Roman soldiers. Or here in this case, the captain of the band would be the chiliarch, the captain of or leader of 1,000 soldiers. So we're dealing with a large contingent of military power here at the hands of the Roman authorities. And why did he do this? Well, he heard that all Jerusalem was in confusion. Remember that the Roman leaders, including these military authorities, were very concerned about preserving order in the Roman culture. The one thing that the Romans would not tolerate, they would tolerate many things, but one thing they wouldn't tolerate was disorder, confusion. So he was very alarmed when he heard that all of Jerusalem was in confusion, and that accounts for him sending so many soldiers in such a swift and decisive way. Question 2. So the chief captain forthwith, that is immediately, without delay, took his soldiers and centurions. Soldiers and centurions. That would be verse 32. That is, rulers over the hundreds, and entered the crowd. Question 3, true or false? The presence of the chief captain and the soldiers caused the mob to stop their attack upon Paul. That's true. Yes, they recognized people who were acting in the sort of mob violence, recognized immediately the presence of the Roman soldiers in great might and military power, and they left off beating Paul, verse 32 says. Question 4. Next, the chief captain approached Paul and bound him with what? 2 chains. And he then asked him this question, who he was and what he had done. Actually, 2 parts there. Who are you and what have you done? He's trying to investigate and determine the cause of this confusion and insurrection. True or false? The crowd was very helpful in getting to the truth in the matter. That would be false. The text says, some shouted one thing and some another among the crowd. And so therefore, Paul was brought into the what? Into the castle. Into the castle. Question 7, as they neared the stairs, why was it necessary for Paul to be borne or carried by the soldiers? Well, because of the violence of the crowd. You see at this point a mob situation. You see violence. You see the crowd to the point where they could have easily killed Paul or torn him apart in the violence. And so these soldiers are actually carrying him because of the crowd. And what were they crying out at the time? They were crying out, "Away with him, away with him." Verse 37 of Acts chapter 21. And as Paul was about to be brought into the castle, he saith unto the chief captain, May I say something unto thee? And he said, Dost thou know Greek? Art thou not the Egyptian who before these days stirred up to sedition and led out into the wilderness the 4,000 men of the assassins? But Paul said, I am a Jew of Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city, and I beseech thee, give me leave to speak unto the people. I think there's an interesting lesson here for us that as members of the church we need to keep in mind. Sometimes we find ourselves in a situation where there is confusion over what we're teaching. Confusion, maybe opposition based upon that confusion. That is, sometimes the preaching and teaching of the gospel is opposed really for no good reason. It's because of confusion. People don't understand what's being presented, what's actually being taught. When the gospel of Jesus Christ is taught with clarity, simplicity, focus, it's generally quite palatable, acceptable. People generally look upon it as logical and rational. It makes sense. Where we get into trouble sometimes is when the message is confused and people think that what's being taught is something else, something than the actual message that's being presented. Sometimes the best thing to do is to pause and say, may I say something to you? Even in the violence of this situation under these chaotic and frightening conditions, Paul has the presence of mind to pause and say, may I say something unto you? So, why was the chief captain surprised when he said that? Well, because Paul knew how to speak Greek, and that surprised the chief captain. He didn't expect that. We find out that he thought Paul was somebody else. Question 2, from verse 38, it's obvious that the chief captain had confused Paul with somebody else. Who was that? An Egyptian who had provoked 4,000 men to sedition. That is, insurrection against the law. So, we're not told about that historic incident here in the text, but evidently there was an Egyptian back in and around that time who had led a large uprising, some 4,000 men. And this chief captain, in the confusion, thought that Paul was that person. So he was surprised to find that he could speak Greek. And Paul, in response, identifies himself, first of all, as a Jew. He says, I am of Tarsus, which is a city in Cilicia. In fact, he says it's a city of no mean city. And actually, not on this particular map, but if we go back to a prior map, we can see Tarsus. It's listed here on this map. You have Paul's second missionary journey, and right to the northwest area there of the Mediterranean Sea, you can see where the city of Tarsus is, and this purple area surrounding that is Cilicia. So that's the area that Paul is identifying as his origin. He says he's a Jew. He says, I am of Tarsus in Cilicia. And finally, and significantly, he says, I am a Roman citizen of no mean or insignificant city. The fact that he is a Roman citizen will become very, very important. Acts 21 and verse 40. And when he had given him leave, Paul, standing on the stairs, beckoned with the hand unto the people. And when there was made a great silence, he spake unto them in the Hebrew language, saying. Now we stop there at the end of chapter 21. Here's the question. After giving him leave or permission to speak, Paul's bonds were evidently loosed, for he was able to beckon with the hand unto the people. Remember, he had been bound by 2 chains, so already we're seeing some confidence in Paul, a recognition, hey, this man isn't a wild, dangerous maniac. He's communicating intelligently, and I want to hear what he has to say. So he is evidently loosed, at least to some extent, and is allowed to beckon with his hand and speak. What's the purpose for beckoning with the hand? We saw that back in chapter 13 and verse 16. Well, obviously, if there's an uproar or a noisy crowd going on and people calling out and shouting things, to beckon with the hand is to get attention and to quiet them down so that Paul could be heard. Question 2, with the crowd silenced, Paul began to address them in the blank language. That would be the Hebrew language. We notice here, incidentally, that Paul was at least bilingual. He could speak fluent Greek, but he was also able to speak fluent Hebrew. He was a bilingual, at least, and educated and capable speaker. And that's the end of chapter 21. Moving into chapter 22, we find Paul's address to the people. And I'd like to read just verses 1 and 2 here to begin with. Brethren and fathers, hear ye the defense which I now make unto you. And when they heard that he spake unto them in the Hebrew language, they were the more quiet. And he saith. All right, stop for a moment and look at these 2 questions at the top of page 138 in your material. Question 1, which 2 terms of respect does Paul use to address the people? Brethren and fathers. Again, I believe it is significant, and we see this repeatedly in the teaching and the style of Paul in his presentation, that he always speaks respectfully to his audience. He could have omitted this greeting. He could have just launched right into his speech. But by saying brethren, he forms, at least on the surface, a connection with his audience. He shows a relationship to his audience that they would respect. Further, the term fathers suggests great respect. There may have been older people in that audience, those of a prior generation. One of the things we need to make sure that we do when we're preaching or teaching God's word is always demonstrate respect for our audience. And the Apostle Paul was sure to do this. Remember that you may be addressing older people. There used to be a saying about showing respect to your elders, and or that children should keep silence when they're around their elders. Well, we've kind of gotten away from that a little bit. But culturally speaking, there has, at least historically, been a recognition that it is a wise thing to show respect to older people. Older people have life experiences. They have background that we may be lacking. They have a vantage point that is not yet ours. That's worthy of respect. The Bible consistently speaks of showing respect to the elderly, to the gray head, if you will, or the hoary head, as the scriptures refer to it. And so we need to recognize that we're dealing with a matter of respect, and we should treat it that way and treat our audience accordingly. Question 2, the people become more quiet when they hear Paul speaking to them in what language? Hebrew, their native tongue. So they've quieted down now, and they're ready to hear from the Apostle Paul a somewhat lengthy message. Verses 3 through 16 contain essentially Paul's restatement of his conversion to Christ. We have already studied this material. Back in chapter 9, when Paul was converted, we read about his encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus and how he was told to go into the city, into Damascus, and there it would be told him what he must do. He encountered the Lord on the road to Damascus. He recognized him after he was identified as Jesus Christ. He heard the gospel, and this changed his life forever. Excuse me. We're not going to go back and study all of the details of that conversion again. I would encourage you, those who are listening to this broadcast, to tune in during the next hour for our worship service. And in our sermon in the next hour, we're going to look closely at the conversion of this great man of God, particularly from this particular chapter, Acts chapter 22. And at that point, we will try to notice a few important, highly significant points that are of benefit to us. But for now, I'm just going to read these verses and move over this relatively quickly. We'll read Acts 22, verses 3 through 16. Paul speaking, I am a Jew born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, instructed according to the strict manner of the law of our fathers, being zealous for God, even as ye all are this day. And I persecuted this way unto the death, binding and delivering into prisons both men and women, as also the high priest doth bear me witness, and all the estate of the elders, from whom also I received letters unto the brethren, and journeyed to Damascus to bring them also that were there unto Jerusalem in bonds to be punished. And it came to pass that as I made my journey and drew nigh unto Damascus about noon, suddenly there shone from heaven a great light round about me. And I fell unto the ground and heard a voice saying unto me, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? And I answered, Who art thou, Lord? And he said unto me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom thou persecutest. And they that were with me beheld indeed the light, but they heard not the voice of him that spake to me. And I said, What shall I do, Lord? And the Lord said unto me, Arise and go into Damascus, and there it shall be told thee of all things which are appointed for thee to do. And when I could not see for the glory of that light, being led by the hand of them that were with me, I came into Damascus. And one Ananias, a devout man according to the law, well reported of by all the Jews that dwelt there, came unto me, and standing by me said unto me, Brother Saul, receive thy sight. And in that very hour I looked up on him. And he said, The God of our fathers hath appointed thee to know his will, and to see the righteous one, and to hear a voice from his mouth. For thou shalt be a witness for him unto all men of what thou hast seen and heard. And now, why tarriest thou? Arise and be baptized, and wash away thy sins, calling on his name. These verses, as I've indicated, contain the second of three accounts in the book of Acts of Paul's conversion, which we have already studied. The first and primary account is from Acts chapter 9, and you may want to go back, if you haven't done this recently, and review Acts 9, verses 1 through 19. The other account, incidentally, is over in Acts chapter 26, where Paul will again relate the facts concerning his conversion. If you really want to get a full handle on that conversion, you want to read all three of these accounts. Question 2, how does Paul identify himself in verse 3? He does say first that he is brought up or was brought up, raised in this city, that's Jerusalem. He identifies himself as a Jew, secondly. Also, that he was educated by Gamaliel. We talked about Gamaliel previously, back in chapter 5, verse 33 and following. Gamaliel was a wise and respected Jewish rabbi. He operated a tutoring type school, and the name was well known, so that when Paul referred to it, there were no doubt people in that audience who were familiar with Gamaliel and his schooling. Incidentally, when Paul is speaking to this audience, just picture this. Paul is probably speaking to many who were there when the church was established back in Acts chapter 2, and when it was growing and multiplying, and when Paul was persecuting the early church. Next, he says he was instructed according to strict Jewish law. Also, that he was as zealous as his audience, and that he was born in Tarsus of Cilicia. So all of those should be checked off. Those were ways by which Paul described himself and identified himself. He refers to the way, or this way, in verse 4. He says, I persecuted this way. What is this way? Well, evidently a reference to Christianity itself, because Paul was persecuting the early church in their way of Christian living. Notice that it is likely that some in Paul's audience were actual former companions of his back when he was persecuting the church. Think of that, how it must have felt standing up and preaching or speaking to this audience, some of whom were with him, supporting him, and actively persecuting the church previously as he had been. Like the other examples of conversions in the book of Acts, Paul was required, question 5, he was required to be what? Baptized, that's verse 16, to do what? To wash away his sins. So the purpose of baptism is clearly set forth here in verse 16. Baptism is more than just an outward sign, a show. It's more than a mere formality or a ritual or an act that we go through on a schedule. Baptism is for, or in order to, obtain the remission of sins. That's its purpose, according to verse 16. All right, Acts 22, verses 17 through 21. And it came to pass that when I had returned to Jerusalem, and while I prayed in the temple, I fell into a trance, and saw him saying unto me, Make haste, and get thee quickly out of Jerusalem, because they will not receive of thee testimony concerning me. And I said, Lord, they themselves know that I imprisoned and beat in every synagogue them that believed on thee. And when the blood of Stephen, thy witness, was shed, I also was standing by and consenting and keeping the garments of them that slew him. And he said unto me, Depart, for I will send thee forth far hence unto the Gentiles. So, following his conversion, Paul at some point returned to which city? To the city of Jerusalem. It says, when I had returned to Jerusalem. Question 2, in a trance, which incidentally, a trance would be a dreamlike state of consciousness in which one would be receptive to some message from God, and that God in those days often did, and in prior days in a miraculous way, speak to people directly, that is, separate and apart from his written word that we have today. So in a trance, he saw whom? Jesus Christ. Question 3, Paul was told to quickly leave Jerusalem because, quote, they will not receive or listen to what concerning me? The answer is testimony. They will not receive testimony. Testimony suggests that Paul was especially qualified to be a witness. He had seen the risen Lord with his own eyes. He had heard him. He had spoken with him, had communications with him. So he had knowledge firsthand. He was therefore competent to testify, to provide testimony. But even though he was competent, we find Jesus saying, they will not receive your testimony. Do you ever know of a court case where someone got on the stand and provided testimony and it wasn't received? Might have been truthful, but the jury or the fact finder, whoever it was, just didn't believe it, didn't receive it. That's what Jesus is saying will be the case with regard to Paul's testimony. True or false, although it was a stirring scene, excuse me, Paul had promptly forgotten the stoning of Stephen. Well, that's false, of course. He, I'm sure, had that indelible image in his mind for the rest of his life from back in Acts chapter 7. Remember, Saul was the one who was holding their coats while they stoned Stephen to death. I'm sure that's something he could never forget. Question 5, Paul was commissioned to bring the gospel to the blank, to the Gentiles, verse 21. Verses 22 and 23, and they gave him audience unto this word. And they lifted up their voice and said, away with such a fellow from the earth, for it is not fit that he should live. And as they cried out and threw off their garments and cast dust into the air, we'll stop there at the end of verse 23 for a couple of questions. Number 1, his Jewish audience tolerated Paul's speech until which word? Well, if you look in verses 21 and 22, you see the word Gentiles. They listened to him until he said, in essence, that the gospel was to go, the message of God was also to go to the Gentiles. They didn't want to hear that. Number 2, in a demonstration of extreme rage, which of the following did these Jews do? Well, first, yes, they shouted, away with him, away with Paul from the earth, for it is not fit that he should live. Notice the seriousness of what they're saying there. This man is not worthy to live. That's how strongly they felt about this Jew-Gentile matter. Next, they threw off their clothing. The rending of one's clothing was historically a symbol of great outrage and distress, and that they did. And also they threw dust or dirt up into the air, another customary way of expressing great anger and frustration. Verse 24. The chief captain commanded him to be brought into the castle, bidding that he should be examined by scourging, that he might know for what cause they so shouted against him. And when they had tied him up with the thongs, Paul said unto the centurion that stood by, is it lawful for you to scourge a man that is a Roman and uncondemned? And when the centurion heard it, he went to the chief captain and told him, saying, what art thou about to do? For this man is a Roman. And the chief captain came and said unto him, tell me, art thou a Roman? And he said, yea. And the chief captain answered, with a great sum obtained I this citizenship. And Paul said, but I am a Roman born. They then that were about to examine him straightway departed from him, and the chief captain also was afraid when he knew that he was a Roman. and because he had bound him. Question 1, this is top of page 140. Unable to see through the confusion, the chief captain ordered Paul brought into the blank, into the castle, to be scourged. Now, there's a note there that the Roman scourging, or whipping, was used as a painfully effective method of extracting statements from criminals. The victim was tied to a short post with the skin of his back stretched and exposed. Leather thongs called flagella, weighted with lead or bone, sometimes pieces of sharp metal, were used for this purpose. The Roman law strictly prohibited binding, much less beating, an untried Roman citizen. Keep that in mind. So in your own words, what was Paul's question to the Roman centurion who was about to scourge him? Well, he's essentially saying, is what you're about to do, is that legal? Is it lawful for you to scourge a Roman who is uncondemned? You know, an honest soldier or police officer, when confronted with the question, is what you're about to do legal, and then immediately given additional facts that they didn't know before, would cause anyone, any reasonable person, to pause. And that was Paul's calculated effect, which in fact occurred here. Question 3, the centurion reported Paul's question to the blank. Well, that would be to the chief captain, who came and asked Paul, "Tell me, art thou a Roman?" An earnest, sincere question. Are you a Roman? True or false? In an effort to turn the other cheek, Paul decided not to mention that he was a Roman. Well, that's false, of course. But why is that question here? Well, occasionally we hear that in a misapplication of Jesus' statement about turning the other cheek, that Christians should not even assert their rights under the law. And I want you to notice that Paul didn't hesitate when it was appropriate to assert his rights under the law, if it would advance the cause of Christ, which certainly this would do. Question 5, of the two ways to become a Roman citizen, place a C before the method used by the chief priest and a P before the course taken by Paul. Well, purchasing it with a great sum was done by the chief priest. There should be a C in front of that. One of the ways that a person in that day could become a Roman citizen had to do with purchasing it, which is what the chief priest had done. But Paul was born, he says, I am a Roman born, so you should have a P there before by birth. And question 6, with this discovery, those about to scourge Paul immediately departed, and the chief captain himself was what? Afraid. Why? Because he had bound a Roman citizen. Verse 30 says, but on the morrow, desiring to know the certainty wherefore he was accused of the Jews, he loosed him and commanded the chief priests and all the council to come together, and brought Paul down and set him before them. What did the chief captain desire to know for sure? He wanted to know why the Jews were accusing Paul. What's the problem here? What's the basis for the uproar? Question 2. Unbinding Paul, the chief captain called together the who? The chief priests and all the council. That would be the Sanhedrin. Remember, the Sanhedrin council consisted of 70 Jews. There were Pharisees, there were Sadducees, but they were together known as this body of them of 70 was known as the Sanhedrin or the council. And he set Paul before them. So with that, we come to the close of chapter 22. We're ready to go into chapter 23, where Paul is going to make this masterful defense before the Sanhedrin. Please read carefully chapters 23 and 24 for the next class. We do have those worksheets available for you. We will be emailing them out to our distribution list. And if you don't receive those or have any problem getting them for any reason, feel free to contact us. We'll be happy to get you worksheets for the next 2 chapters for our class. Thank you very much for listening, for joining in the study together. We're going to conclude our class. I do want to remind you to stay tuned. Here in about 15 minutes, we begin our Sunday morning worship service, and looking forward to that sermon based on some of what we've studied here in class together. Thanks for listening today.